Are model organisms still relevant to biology? How can we spot and debunk science misinformation? Should we use data on human genetics when developing social policies? Have you heard of the stealth organ that ants manipulate during development to create super soldiers? Or the single gene in a plant that alters the fate of an entire food web? Join biologists Art Wood and Marty Martin along with new co-host Cameron Gallenbaugh for Season 5 of Big Biology. Art, Marty and Cam talk with researchers, journalists, historians and philosophers thinking about the biggest, most groundbreaking questions in biology, ranging across fields from ecology, physiology and evolution to neuroscience and psychology. The goal is to inform and debate in a fun, casual way that's accessible to all. Subscribe to Big Biology wherever you get your podcasts, visit thebigbiology.org or follow Big Biology on Instagram, Twitter or Facebook. Hello there, and welcome to Preprints in Motion, a podcast taking a deep dive in the fast-paced world of preprints.
Join us as we sit down with early career researchers, discuss their latest preprint, and find out about their journey through the muddy marshes of academia.
Hit that subscribe button, leave a rating, and find us on Twitter @MotionPod. Support us by heading over to buymeacoffee.com/preprints. But for now, let's get into the show.
We're back for 2023 with an exceptional episode all about the big changes happening this very month over at eLife. I guess we'll start this one with me giving my disclosure, because I'm probably a little bit biased here. I have published in eLife before, because we're talking about eLife. My PhD work was published in eLife. I have also had a paper rejected from eLife. It was desk rejected and then went to PLOS Biology. PLOS Biology were great. We don't get to talk about them very often. And I also very generally just support what eLife do. I quite like a lot of the stuff eLife do. And I am working with Ailish, who runs the eLife community stuff, who is great. Everyone should meet Ailish if they can. She's brilliant. So I have some biases here, but I have put the feelers out on Twitter, and I did try to keep up with what was going on Twitter. So I won't just ask all the nice, easy questions.
We don't like those anyway. So.
I guess what we should do is start with a bit of background to the two of you so people know your voice a little bit.
So I'm Devang Mehta. I'm a new PI just starting my lab at KU Leuven in Belgium. I'm a plant biologist and I'm originally from India. I did my undergraduate in India, then moved to the UK to do a master's in synthetic biology at Imperial College, then to Zurich, Switzerland for my PhD in plant biology, like really moving into eukaryotic biology, and then my postdoc at the University of Alberta in Canada until 2 weeks ago. Yeah, and I've kind of been involved with eLife for 4 years. I completed my term as a eLife early career advisor earlier this year.
So I'm Michael Eisen. I am currently a professor at the University of California, Berkeley in the Department of Molecular Cell Biology and also the Department of Integrative Biology. I'm an investigator with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. I run a lab that has historically worked on fly development, really broadly interested in how gene expression patterns are encoded in genomes, and the lab is kind of a hybrid experimental computational lab. We have other things we've dabbled in, but that's the main thrust of what we do. I have been involved in efforts to reform publishing for a quarter century. When I was a postdoc at Stanford with Pat Brown back in the 90s, the original idea for using the internet to do science publishing in a different way kind of stemmed out of Pat's frustrations with the way that publishing was adapting to the internet, and various projects that Pat initiated, including trying to get the NIH to create this system called eBiomed that would have basically replicated the preprint system that physicists had been using for a while for biology and would have layered peer review on top of it. It was a very forward-thinking, far-reaching proposal to basically redo the whole science publishing industry. It made it as far as being formally proposed by Harold Varmus as a project. It was then, but it was opposed by a sufficiently large fraction of the scientific establishment, especially publishers. It didn't move forward, and it was really the failure of that to take root that led to my getting more heavily involved in this with what ultimately became the Public Library of Science that Harold Varmus and I started in 2001 as an alternative to subscription publishing. We were not the first people to embrace this open access kind of business model of trying to use direct payments from funders or from scientists to to make the contents of the scientific literature freely available, but we really focused our attention on how to grow that model within the science community. And Pat and I were involved with PLOS for 15 years, a little bit more than 15 years on the board, and trying to get PLOS both initially off the ground and then established, and then to do new and different things. I finally rotated off the PLOS board, I don't know, in 2018 or so, and then was encouraged to apply for the job as the editor-in-chief of eLife, something that I initially did not think was a good fit for me, because as much as I like eLife, it was always kind of a conservative organization in my mind, and doing kind of conservative things, sort of standard publishing. I mean, I loved it. I published in eLife. Don't get me wrong. I sent all of my best papers were going to eLife for its period, and I too have been desk rejected and post review rejected. So I've been through the ringer. But I pitched a vision for what eLife could evolve into that was different than a standard journal, really kind of drawing on ideas that had been in at least in my mind, since that eBiomed proposal from Harold back in the 90s, which were to redo science publishing around preprints and around the, effectively the post-publication review of articles that were already published by the authors as preprints. As you know, in the interim, while we were off dealing with PLOS, preprints finally took off in the biomedical community with the launch of bioRxiv and medRxiv. And so it seemed like there was really a nice opportunity to take advantage of the growth of preprints and to kind of redirect the peer review engine and really the peer review community that eLife had built towards the review of preprints. So that's my background.
It's an interesting point to actually labour on a little bit, which is when you started this, these changes aren't new. You kind of had these ideas a while back, and they would have been proposed when you started, and they would have been approved by a whole bunch of people before they come into effect. And it's just one of those things I saw very much on Twitter was people seemed to be surprised by this sudden change, and were questioning if anyone else had looked over it, as if you'd come in and just unilaterally declared, this is what I'm doing and this is what's happening tomorrow. So I think it's good people to appreciate that a little bit.
I must say that caught me a little bit by surprise, just simply because, yes, like the things we're doing now were the basis for my proposal to the eLife board for what I would do as editor-in-chief. And in many ways, we've kind of taken it a little slower than I'd initially anticipated, in part to the pandemic was a little bit of a disruption, but also just, trying to do it in a little more controlled way. I also, we did telegraph, when we launched the preprint review process about 2 years ago, we tried to make it very clear that where we were headed with this. I thought we were being pretty transparent about where we were headed. I understand the timeline, communication's never perfect, and probably we could have done a better job of kind of communicating the inner workings of our process to people sometimes. But, it's a complicated problem. It's a big organization. There were a lot of behind the scenes kind of changes that needed to be made here. We're taking a staff that worked in traditional publishing to produce articles in a traditional way and really trying to redo that. And I think, we did spend quite a long time trying to think through like what it was going to take to do this, what it should look like, how it was going to work. And, we had a broad mandate from the board to do this, but the board is, wanted very specific kind of plans for how we were going to do it and what it was going to do to the business. And, those boards are charged with that. So there was a lot of, it took quite some time to get a kind of view of this that everybody at the leadership team at least was on board with. And so, it's one of the challenges in publishing is, and I've experienced this before with PLOS to some extent, where, people are they're so sure they know how publishing is going to work in the future that they kind of miss the signs in some ways. And again, there's not like, to the extent that people didn't know where we were going, that's our fault. But also, it is hard to convince people that you're doing something new. And I think they are used to an industry that moves very slowly, very cautiously, and very deliberately. And I just that's not what we're trying to do. So
I mean, I think it's also because like scientists are weird. Like we rely on publishing so much, but we just don't pay attention to it. Like I talk to so many colleagues about preprints, like even something that's been around for I don't know 8 years now, I guess. And people don't know about bioarchive. They don't know about preprint review. They don't know about review comments. And then when we have these changes at eLife that have been telegraphed for 2 years or even more than 2 years, I think, since Mike came on, I think a lot of people either they see those announcements and they don't put the two things together, or they just don't pay attention to publishing as much as they should.
That's where my Twitter thing came from, really, was trying to put a bit of context with things. I think scientists, I've known professors who've been doing science for like longer than I've been in existence, but they've never studied how we do science. They know how to do it, but it's like a mechanic can drive a car. I can drive a car, but I couldn't fix a car. It's a weird gap in the knowledge.
One of the things that has caught me a little bit by surprise is how hard it is for people to think about publishing in a different way. I think, obviously, like, I've been doing this for a long time. It's like my own brain's been conditioned to think of it in different ways. But, like, the one thing that's surprised me more than anything is just how much significance people put on the idea that something is published, right? Like, what that means. And so, even though the real, sort of core of what we're trying to do is to say that, what it means to be published has changed, right? Published used to literally mean what it said. It was made public, right? And, that was obviously true in print. Work, in some sense, didn't exist really until it manifested itself in print. And then, that's for practical technological reasons. Then in the early days of the internet, that was true for stupid reasons, which was that people were paywalling articles. And so, if you don't make the article freely available at any point during the process of its construction, even though you could, and then you collect them together and kind of only make them available in this one place if you pay, it maintained the kind of functional process of publishing, even though it no longer technologically necessary. But preprints in particular kind of break that logic. I mean, if you're posting your work as a preprint sort of whenever you're ready, the journal isn't a publisher. The journal, right, the author is a publisher. And so if you're the author and you're publishing works, what does it mean for something to be published subsequently? And so, even though in this process we're explicitly trying to relinquish any notion that we are a publisher. I mean, yes, we're going to make the articles look pretty and things like that for people because it's sort of a service to authors, but we're not publishing them in any meaningful way because they're already published, and we're really just reproducing the author's already published work and attaching to it reviews that we've created. So if we're publishing anything, we're publishing reviews. And yet, everybody really just wants to think not only of us as publishers, but as the fact that we're publishing something as being a mark of significance. And even though we've tried to say, please don't think of it this way, we're going to actively try to, to change that psychology. It's really hard because so many, like this idea that a work being published means something of value even is so strong, even though everybody, if you sit and talk to an individual scientist and say, what does it mean when a work's been published? Do you believe works that are published are right? Of course not. Lots of stuff published that's wrong. Do you mean that it was peer reviewed well? Nah, lots of peer reviews are done poorly. Like even though they have all the, not only have the knowledge, they will profess to sharing this view about the literature. It's still quite peculiar how strong this notion is, so much so that even when we're saying to people, don't look at us this way, they're like, no, actually, I'm going to keep looking at you this way because that's how, it's just funny. And I'm not, it's not complaining. I understand that people are, people get used to things, but it's sort of an evidence of how generally little attention people play to the kind of meta issues around publishing and kind of what does it mean? How does the industry work? What are we actually doing? And have a very transactional view of the whole process. And that is, in fact, probably one of the biggest challenges we face moving forward is breaking out of that mode. So.
Yeah, to me, it's like the biggest, I don't know, the biggest surprise was when people started objecting to the $2,000 review fee that eLife is going to charge. And, to me, it was like people just didn't realize that they're already paying for peer review. They're already paying for, most of the cost of publishing is really the time that's spent in handling reviews and those kinds of things. And, people think of APCs as a bad thing nowadays, but they don't realize that, a Nature paper also costs the taxpayer a lot of money before open access was a thing. Like the cost thing was really surprising to me. I didn't expect people to see that separate from open access fees that they already pay or subscriptions.
Right. They're not realizing what they're paying for, right? Like I think that like when you attach it to publishing, they're like, okay, it costs money to publish, but not like dissecting what it is you're actually paying for in that process. I mean, again, like I don't think authors should be in the position of having to pay. We're kind of stuck in a bad model that does that. But the fact that people kind of often confuse the person who's paying, which I agree, like the mechanics by which we do this is bad. It's bad to sort of, in some sense, dump an unfunded mandate on scientists and say, yes, we want you to now pick up this bill without giving you any extra money to do it. But at the same time, like a lot of the criticism is around the idea of why does this cost anything? And, I mean, it's fine if you want to question the whole notion of whether we need a publishing industry that does lots of things to papers and so forth to peer review them and format them and stuff. I think you could have a world where bioRxiv is basically it and it's cheap and right that is a valid universe. But in a world where people want all these other things to happen, you just kind of have it costs money to do stuff in the world. And like, the idea that somehow subscription journals are doing it right in some sense because authors don't get charged and nobody sees the bill, disappears into the background, is just another piece where I think people aren't thinking systemically about how publishing works. And, again, it's not what they're paid to do, right? Like this isn't a criticism of people. It's like, it's the typical Twitter problem though, which is like, someone's put like literally 5 minutes into thinking about something and they're sure they have an answer to it, right? Like, I think that's part of the thing that's frustrating. I mean, it's not news to me that this is the way Twitter operates, but like, that a lot of people are expressing opinions about things with a degree of confidence that probably they wouldn't have if they'd spent more time thinking about it. And I think that that's one of our challenges, is just to get more people to think about these things with the same kind of, critical care that they do about the individual papers. And I think if we got to the point where people thought more about publishing as an industry and as a system and what we actually want and how it's structured and how it should be structured, I think it would be a lot better. But this is the problem is, as we're seeing here, is, everybody just accepts the way the system works as if it's God-given, and that they only respond to perturbations. And so when a perturbation happens, it's always judged against this assumption of kind of, that the existing system is both natural and rational. Both things we know are not true, and yet it does in some ways handicap any effort to do something new, just because people aren't spending a lot of time thinking about it. And
we're currently writing a documentary on the history of publishing in science, which we're hopefully going to put out next year, which is fascinating on its own. It's quite a surprising history at times, especially with some of the people involved. So eLife is 10 years old. I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago you did your 10-year birthday. Yeah. And eLife was started I was in my second year of undergrad, and then bioRxiv started as I left undergrad. So I didn't get the early part of eLife. I got the very transformative part of eLife, where you were doing things like having code in part of the paper and being able to run stuff, and which is really cool. And all those innovations that have come since. So it might help a little bit. Could you just give us a bit of an overview as to what the original conception of eLife was? Because my understanding is it's a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can't really speak for the people who created it. So I can give you partly an inside view of it, but really, like, this is an outsider's view of it. And, I was proximal, like, right, like, I was helping to run PLOS at the time, and so I was very much in that world. And, many of the people who were actively involved in founding it were my colleagues at Berkeley, so I heard from them. But, my reading of what motivated it was that it was really an intersection of two things. One, it was funders who had, for the first 15 years or so of the kind of migration of publishing onto the internet, had largely sat on the sidelines, right? That they didn't get involved. There were a smattering of things where people said, yeah, you should publish your paper open access, but it was really very much, again, in this sort of transactional mode. Like, we'd like you to do this, we'll give you a little money to help you do this. Or they had a directional push, but we're kind of relying on the scientific community and the publishing industry to sort of solve problems. And I think by sort of 2010-ish, when I think the first seeds of launching eLife came into people's minds, I think it was clear that that was not working, that the industry was not going to solve these problems, that in fact, even things like PLOS were kind of being, to the extent that they were influencing the industry, they weren't necessarily influencing industry in a good direction. And like, I think that there was a growing sense that publishing was not just kind of this thing that was happening maybe suboptimally in science, but was, not a major problem, to the sense that actually it was a major problem. That the work that funders were bringing into existence via their research funding were not being communicated well. They were in fact being in some ways corrupted by the mechanics of how publishing worked. And so there was a clear interest on the expression of interest on the funders' part to say, like this has to be fixed. And they, I think I'm accurately summarizing the view of Wellcome and Hughes and Max Planck in saying that, they brought eLife into existence to try to address some of those problems with how their work was being communicated. It also, coincided with a sense of kind of growing frustration amongst authors that the publishing industry was asking too much, like it was taking too much control over the research process, that, the number of scientists and the number of great works of science were increasing far more rapidly than the number of slots in high profile publications were. And so there was this sense that the process was not, publishers were too powerful. They could demand too many things from authors. They were demanding too many things from authors. They were starting to put their fingerprints all over the science by saying, yeah, cut out this half of the paper. We only think this part's sexy enough to go into our journal. There's a real and legitimate frustration that peer review was not being carried out in a way that was helpful to science. And so I think, eLife had these two origins, right? It had this funder origin to kind of influence publishing, and this author kind of science view that maybe we could do peer review in a more constructive way. And that's kind of the first 10 years really of eLife, in large part, was about that. It was about building a system of kind of, I would say, more author-focused system of peer review than you typically got at high-profile journals, and to try to make focus on making that process as constructive as possible for science. And, I think by and large was successful. I think some of the things that they did were, I'm not sure how I credit them as completely innovative, but they were, because other people had been doing them, but they were really solidified and built into a really excellent process. I think that, 10 years on, however, then some of the challenge we're facing now is that I think most of the scientists involved were focused on that task, on building a really great peer review system, and not on the more broader challenges of sort of science publishing and how to create it. And that, I think, in retrospect, I probably should have appreciated a little bit more how the things that have motivated scientists and editors to get involved were not the same things that have motivated the funders. That, that there's like, honestly, eLife is a conservative, and I mean that in the small c kind of sense. It's got a kind of almost nostalgic view for a time when publishing was thing that scientists did. It wasn't an industry. It was just this like community of scientists. I think internal perceptions of eLife and external perceptions of eLife can be quite different. I think there's a sense from the outside that eLife is kind of an elite clubby game. I don't think that's true. I think that it actually, if anything, really tries to, in most cases, lean over backwards to not be like that. But it does come from it's certainly born from the elite halls of science. And I don't know, I think the reason that they hired me was that the funders, honestly, that they're the ones who make the decisions about who runs the organization, right? Like that. It's not. I mean, not the funders literally. There's a board of directors, but they're on the board of directors, and they had a vision for eLife that is to be more transformative in science publishing, and I saw this as an opportunity. I never really wanted to be. I like to build things anew rather than take things and try to move them. It's a different challenge, but I do think it has a real opportunity if we can kind of meld these two things together in a different way, to take this kind of view of very author positive kind of peer review that's meant to be constructive and not meant to kind of make demands of authors in ways, and meld it with the world of preprints to create a different, not just a different kind of spirit of publishing, but a really fundamental different way to publish. And that's the way that I've certainly, and I think that, a lot of the leadership view this question of what, how we're trying to move it. But I do think there's a little bit more of a tension at play here between wanting to keep things in this traditional mode and wanting to do something new. And I think we're still working out the best way to kind of navigate that transition. And I'm not sure we've hit all the notes right in trying to make that path, but I think that's what we're trying to do here.
Like, I'll just add, so I joined eLife 1 year before Mike was hired. So I saw eLife before Mike and after Mike. And I can say that basically eLife has always been kind of, so there's a part of eLife that people don't see publicly, which is the staff and the kind of executive team at eLife. And I think they've always been a lot more progressive than the scientists or the editors involved at eLife. So since very early, they had an early career advisory group. They had, postdocs involved in advising on policy. They recruited Prachi to be on the board before Mike was hired, which probably played some role, at least a minor role in Mike's recruitment. But I think those things happened before, recent times as well. Like they've been going on since the start of eLife. eLife also had experiments in peer review. They had a kind of similar experiment to the new model where triage was the only kind of gatekeeping, and there was no post-review except reject decision already. And then they've already had the kind of eLife Ambassadors program, which created a community of global scientists who were in favor of changing and reforming science. So I think all of those things played a role in kind of driving the organization to what it is today. And I think, at least from my perspective, it seemed like the editorial side was kind of always the much more conservative part of the organization. And that, I think, has changed since the new leadership came in.
Yeah, and also I just add, I think one of the problems is it's very hard to paint the editor, like the editors are a very diverse group whose opinions range from being very kind of conservative about publishing in a constructive conservatism and not obstructionist, but to people who have really radical ideas about publishing. So one of the challenges is the editorial operation is a conservative thing in some real sense. It's got a fairly structured way of doing things. It's that works well, and people know what their role is, and they do it well, and they've kind of, it's not easy to build that. So I think that people are rightly proud of having built this machine, however you want to view it. And so as kind of an operation, it's conservative, but it's built of people whose views of what has to happen in publishing range from, being less, like, I'd say having a more deliberate approach to how to make these kind of changes, including some who don't think these changes are a good idea or want to do them, to people who are, who view me as a conservative and have much more radical ideas about what should happen in publishing than I do. So it's a little tricky. Like, interacting with an editorial operation is very different than interacting with a diverse group of editors who have wide-ranging opinions on what should happen. And so I agree. The editorial operation was very conservative in some ways, and yet, it did do these peer review experiments. I think it had this sense that there was something, something different, something needed to give in the way that peer review actually works and the relationship between peer review and preprinting things, for example. But I think in some ways, because it was sort of conservative in its structure or something, it didn't do it as effectively, I think, as maybe the board had been hoping. And so I think that's kind of where I came in a little bit, was like, being willing to do things in a different way. I don't know if they like that or don't like that in retrospect, but we'll see.
I mean, that's probably a bit of a microcosm for academia in general. Right? I always find academia surprisingly conservative, and yet within that you'll find people who are brilliantly forward-thinking and exceptionally forward-thinking, a bit radical. But as a system, it's surprisingly reluctant to any kind of change, annoyingly.
Yeah, there's a great quote somewhere on Twitter from a decade ago about, it goes something like, why is it that, scientists who are so radical in their scientific thinking turn into Randian oligarchic capitalists when they talk about science politics, right? Like, it is really funny. Like, if scientists did research like they think about science publishing, the internet wouldn't exist. Nothing would exist, right? Like, it's like, if science operated with the same kind of, conservative handcuffs that publishing operates with, like, science wouldn't exist. Like, it's such a funny thing that, like, people who really are like many of the most conservative people I encounter in science in terms of thinking about publishing are completely original thinkers, radical scientific thinkers. It's a weird mashup to experience. And so, and I've never fully understood that. Like, that seems like such a cognitive dissonance to live with, that I don't really understand how it happens, but yes.
Well, I think what happens is that, like, we want to be radical in our science, and then a lot of us want to kind of be safe in the publishing world, like, so that we don't have too many risks in our labs. But yeah, I don't know. It doesn't make sense.
So, talking about radical, the recent, and it feels weird to say that, decision by eLife to only publish preprints, because that was surprisingly recent, that...
Only review,
sorry, yeah. That was quite a... No, I'm going back a bit.
So, I mean, I just wanted, even then, right? Like, if they're preprints, they're already published, right? Yeah. So I would view, we were republishing, not publishing.
So only to review preprints.
Yeah.
It was only a couple of years. It was, last year, really. So that would have been viewed as quite radical. But then you went and you've introduced the step that caused such a Twitter storm. eLife was actually trending for a while. So there you go. So could you just briefly explain what those changes actually are to anyone who is listening to this who doesn't somehow know? I assume they're still in the cave, painting their little graphs on the cave wall with handprints.
Right. So obviously we talked about before that one of the things that has been changing in publishing over the last decade has been that increasing number of biomedical scientists have been taking advantage of, kind of the obvious function of the internet to just share their work publicly when they feel ready to share it. That is it's sort of an unfiltered, author-directed publishing. So preprints are that. They're just like a way for authors to share their manuscript on their own timeline when they think it's ready to be shared with the public. And, there's a little bit of infrastructure to do that well and effectively that's been created by Cold Spring Harbor through bioRxiv. And, it was a little bit of a slog to get people to kind of accept that this wasn't going to break science to post their work prior to peer review. But I think some of the failings of publishing in general, the slow pace of it and things like that, kind of gave people an opening to see the advantages of preprints and, the fact that you could share your work quickly. And And so preprinting took off. It's still hardly the majority, but the majority of biomedical published papers are still not posted as preprints, still a small fraction. But the eLife community, for a variety of reasons, was enriched for people who posted their work as preprints, in part because eLife was very supportive of it. So, unlike other places which might say, well, yeah, we don't really want your work out until we publish it because we want to highlight it. eLife from the beginning was like, this is great, post preprints. The community that eLife tends to draw from was, kind of more preprint positive. So we were tracking preprint use, and in fact, what we had wanted, because the way we think about publishing is around the idea that things are published first by the authors as preprints, and then we review them. That's always been our kind of simple way of saying what we wanted to move to in publishing. But even I was surprised when we looked at the numbers and found that close to 70% of our authors, by the time they submitted their work to us, it had already been posted as a preprint, either well before they submitted it or at the point of submission. And so we realized that it wasn't much of an ask to just say, well, let's just do that for everything, right? And so first thing, and this, was about 2 years ago, we just made the decision that, henceforth we would only review things that were posted as preprints. This was not a radical step in some ways because we were kind of already doing it. So I viewed it more as a recognition of the reality that we were actually not a publisher anymore, that what we were was an organization that reviewed preprints. And instead of just saying, okay, that's what we're doing, we also said, okay, so if we're reviewing preprints, how should that change how we do reviews? And so, from 2 years ago, we started to produce public-facing reviews of preprints. That is to not just say, well, we're going to take our existing peer reviews and put them online, which is eLife has always done, is always publishes the peer reviews. But part of the problem with that is that standard peer reviews are written for the authors and the journal. They're not written for the outside world. They're, they can get into minutia that the outside world isn't going to care about. They often ignore things that the outside world will care about, right? If you think one part of a paper cripples the paper irreparably from being published, that's what you focus on in standard peer review. Whereas if 90% of the paper is great and makes an important contribution to science, in public-facing peer review, that's what you should be focusing on, not the weaknesses that prevent its publication, but rather the strengths that highlight it. So, we slowly, it took a little while to get people kind of accustomed to this, started to ask our peer reviewers and editors to think about producing public reviews of preprints. bioRxiv created a mechanism to post those, so we started to do that. We didn't do it in one big step, but we decided that we would introduce the notion of public preprint reviews while still going through the traditional process of deciding whether or not a paper gets published in eLife. And so we were trying to make sure that we could do this well, that the process was smooth, that that people weren't we really had to focus on making these public preprints reviews constructive and appropriate for the public. And I think we did a really excellent job of that. Our reviewers and editors, I think, really took to that quite well. And we were producing lots of preprints with peer reviews. An important and necessary step in the evolution of science was to start really directly associating our reviews with the preprints. That we did, I think we posted something like 2,300 reviews of preprints with reviews over the last 2 years, something of that order of magnitude. And now we had some processes in place. If we rejected the paper in the peer review process, the authors could decline to have the reviews posted until it was published elsewhere, which is not ideal, but was kind of done to assuage fears from our editors that we would scare away authors by kind of posting reviews. And, we did still make publishing decisions. And, the problem with that is that it goes back to what we were talking about before. In a world where everybody focuses on publishing decisions and not on what actually underlies those publishing decisions, it's very hard to get people to pay attention to anything else. And the kind of analogy I used for this was, if you offered a scientist two choices, you were going to have a you post a preprint, it gets peer reviewed, and your two choices are, it gets trashed by peer reviewers, like just completely eviscerated by peer reviewers, saying this is poorly conceived of, the data are, data were poorly collected, and I don't know why you bothered to do this experiment, but we're going to publish it in Nature. If that was option number one, terrible peer reviews, but a Nature publication. And peer review two was, we think this work is really great. There's a lot here to love. It's fantastic. Like the reviews say, it's fantastic. It's, the most interesting paper I've read in a while. This data are going to have a profound impact on science and on people's lives. And it was published in PLOS One. The overwhelming majority of scientists would choose the trashed Nature paper over the lauded PLOS One paper. And so I think that fact and the realization that honestly, like, people just weren't paying attention to what we were doing with peer review, it highlighted the fact that for us, that as long as we continue to make these in-out decisions at eLife, we were just never going to get people to pay attention to the peer reviews. And so that led us to start asking just the question, like, okay, so should we, what's the best path forward here? Is it to launch a new journal that doesn't make decisions? Is it to stop making decisions? Is it to do both at the same time? And I think, we just came to what I think is a kind of an escapable conclusion, although there are people who disagree, that the best way to make this work is to stop making decisions. Like, if we think the publishing decisions themselves are the problem, which they are, it's not just that they don't let people pay attention to other things. Like, publishing decisions are terrible for science. I mean, attaching citations to papers implies that they're right. It implies that their value is knowable at the time they're initially conceived of. They're, they become a currency at the expense of the value of the underlying science. There's a million reasons why it's bad to give tokens to papers instead of to assess the science. And we just felt like, this is a bad system. It may have served us well. People may like it. People may have gotten us this far, but it's obviously, the system is not good. And it just felt impossible to speak on one side of our mouths and say, we don't think that making publishing decisions is a good idea, and at the same time say, yeah, we're going to keep doing it. And so that led to led us down this path to saying, okay, now what does it look like to transition away from making publishing decisions at all? And I think, we talked to a lot of people about how they were perceiving preprint reviews, and I think there were some things that were clearly not implemented well in how the reviews are associated with preprints on bioRxiv, and maybe they'll evolve in a nice way. But we felt like the main thing we wanted to do was to create this notion that there's a new type of entity in the world that we're creating, which is a preprint that has peer reviews. And that's different than a preprint, because the preprint stands on its own. A preprint with peer reviews, the preprint can still stand on its own, but the peer reviews can add context and value. But that there's no such thing as a published paper anymore. The journals reassess the work that someone else has published. Maybe they change it in response to our reviews and we reassess it. But at no point do we say, you're in, you're out, because that process inevitably leads to a focus on the decision and an ignorance of the process. So that's what led us down this trail of deciding that in the future we would continue to do peer review of preprints and produce public reviews and write assessments of the papers in a way that people could use and think about and understand what our actual conclusions about the paper were, but that we would no longer use those to categorize papers into kind of in and out of any kind of club.
So I suspect I know the answer to this, but how do you think that's going to impact editorial decisions, if at all? Do you think you're still going to accept, reject at the same kind of rate at the editor level?
Well, I mean, so I would question the use of accept and reject here. So we're not accepting and rejecting anything ever. And we are, obviously we can't review every paper published. More importantly, I don't think we can review every paper, and I'm using the term published there deliberately, every paper published on a preprint server. We can't review them all well, in part because we don't have infinite expertise, but also because, reviewing a paper in public well requires that someone have a, at least some, they be motivated to do the work that's necessary to do it. And I think what would motivate people to do it is a complicated question, but at least for now, like we have, what motivates people to want to do it is they have to want to do it. And that's going to be a complicated thing that motivates you to want to think that it's worth time and effort reviewing this particular preprint as opposed to some other preprint that you could be spending your time on. And so we are making decisions about where we think we can best use our capacity for peer review and producing public peer reviews and so forth in a positive and constructive way for both the authors and the public. So, that means like probably not reviewing papers where the basic thing that we would say is this just doesn't make any sense, or I just can't write a productive peer review of something where you say, well, you just didn't generate enough data to say anything about this problem. I mean, that's not a useful public peer review. And I think also, sometimes, if it's a COVID paper that makes claims that affect public health and are really poorly founded, that's a valuable paper to peer review. So it's not that you will only review papers you like. There are good reasons to review papers that where your overall assessment will be negative. Maybe they contain something really useful. Maybe they contain like a really great idea that wasn't executed well. There's like a lot of reasons why people might be motivated to write public reviews of a paper when they think that they can do a good job and put them in public. But that doesn't mean that it neither means that the only way to do this is to review everything, nor does it mean that people should read anything into the fact that we chose to review it. All it means is that somebody chose to review it. And that this has been that point I was trying to make at the beginning, that we tell people, don't read anything into our decision to review a paper. Treat this like it was just random. And everybody says, no, this is going to be the new publishing decision, and now we are going to impose on this idea that now an eLife paper is whatever you decided to peer review, which is, it's not what we're trying to do. Obviously, we can't tell people what to think, but we can try to explain that is not the thing. And I hope that once, we're in this weird period where we've announced that we're going to do it, but we're not yet really doing it. And so I hope that once people see this, and they see that when they get to a paper and it's got our assessment on the front and the easily accessible peer reviews, that they won't say, oh, they peer reviewed it, therefore it's interesting or important. They'll say, okay, what do they actually think about it? I do feel like this notion that people have that we're going to just be doing triage-based publishing, I just don't think that will survive the experience of what people actually see. Once they start to see that we peer reviewed some papers they find boring, or they peer review some papers that they find that we say are wrong, or we peer review some papers that we say are, intriguing idea but poorly executed. Like, there's a lot of things we might end up saying about a paper. Once people realize that when they look at our peer reviews and they see that there's a wide range of outputs from our peer review process, that they won't think that way anymore. I hope. That's sort of, we're betting on that, because if what happens is the only thing that matters is your paper was peer reviewed by eLife, and no matter what we say, and then we've gone backwards, not forward. So it's
just one thing I wanted to pick up was the point Mike made about what motivates people to review, because so far I think it's maybe been like a mix of being truly a scientist by participating in this process, but also maybe liking the fact that you control what goes out and what doesn't go out in the literature. And I want to see what motivates people to review in this new model, because one thing that people maybe missed out in the announcement was that these reviews are still going to be completely anonymous. So reviewers won't be allowed to reveal who they are, at least on eLife's website. Maybe they can tweet it out later. So it's an anonymous review that you're doing for eLife. So I want to see what motivates people to do that, and if who gets motivated to review for eLife in that kind of situation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad the accept reject language was picked up on. That was a deliberate thing, because that is, I think everyone is kind of stuck on that. It's a binary decision, and it's not. And I think that's where certainly some of the people I've spoken to, that's I think where some of their confusion's coming from. And you're also answering some of the other questions I've had, which is things like, what the role of the reviewer is. What you're doing is tapping into an expert pool you have. Because one of the questions I got was, how are you going to select reviewers? Are you going to require viewers to disclose their identities? Or would you reject a reviewer for a paper?
So first of all, we're going to choose reviewers just like we always have, which is there's an editor who handles the paper and they try their best to pick and successfully recruit the most appropriate reviewers to handle that paper. I mean, the reason people come to eLife or any other journal that they trust is that they are confident in our ability to find knowledgeable, fair, open-minded and constructive reviewers for their papers. And that is an incredibly difficult ask in general, right? I think one of the reasons why it's hard to review everything is the more specialized, the more narrow the audience for a paper, the more flaws that are manifest in a paper when you just look at it, things like that, the more difficult it is to get reviewers who will participate. And we could have a conversation about how to incentivize reviews in another moment, but at the moment, right, like we rely on a knowledgeable editor who knows the field, knows where the paper fits into the context of the field, knows who they can rely on to provide good feedback on the work, both to the authors and the public, and they find them. So ultimately, that is the value we provide as an organization, is in identifying the right people to weigh in on a paper. And that involves both making sure they're appropriate in terms of their expertise and that they do the job well, that they're fair and open-minded and constructive and not, to the extent that we can tell, at least not biased. And the effectiveness of that process is really on us. It's about the organization and not about the individuals we chose to do the review. And so we made, I think, probably what will seem like a counterintuitive decision to some people, which is that we decided to just not reveal the reviewers' identities at all, even if they want to, in the public peer reviews. In part because I really feel like you either have to have everybody identify themselves or nobody identify themselves, because otherwise it just becomes you sign a review when you've said something nice and you want to curry favor with the author, or you sign the review when you want to. It's like like I don't know, like a lot of people just do it out of principle, but I think you have this problem that sometimes they'll do it because they either want to say, hey, I reviewed your paper nicely, right? Like it's definitely true that people are more willing to identify themselves if they've said nice things than if they've said not nice things. And sometimes they might be kind of a power play, like, I am the big person in your field, how dare you say something I disagree with, right? I think that either it just has to be something everybody does or nobody, but we can't have a system where everybody does it because tons of people just don't feel like they're in a position in the field to speak honestly about other people's work if they have to identify themselves. And so I think this idea that we solve problems of bias and politeness and things like that by making people sign things is every day invalidated by Twitter. And I think that instead, we just have to make it, one of our big missions as an organization to be so good at finding reviewers and making sure the process is constructive and fair that you trust us. Now, we know who the reviewers are, right? Like, it's not a completely anonymous process. You have to trust us as an organization and as editors to have done that job well. And that's kind of why we've decided not to identify any of our peer reviewers in the public reviews. So
I do think that like one thing eLife should focus on in the future is improving the way it selects reviewers, because I think right now it's extremely based on, who the editor knows, and it's a very close network of people. And we know that there's bias with peer review, even at eLife, from previous data. So,
oh yeah, there's no
and I'm sure that people are working on this, and the early career advisory group is definitely focused on it. But yeah, I don't think we should say that it's perfect right now, but it's definitely, the goal is to improve it.
I mean, I don't think there is a perfect academic publishing system. It's always going to be twisted in some way.
Well, I mean, people are doing, like, eLife is doing experiments, right? So eLife recently had this open call for reviewing editors from Latin America and the Caribbean. So, this is the first time I've seen a major journal have like an application system where any academic can come in and say they want to be an editor and show that they can do the task, and then join the editorial board. So I think things like that will definitely help show people that eLife's reviewing process is also representative and fair.
Yeah, we plan to. I think we're very happy with how this open call for reviewers from Latin America went. I mean, I think we recognize a major flaw in eLife's universe is that it is, at least one of the things I've been, not just me, but the organization as a whole has been focused on since I came on, at least, was making our editorial board less white, less male, less American, less from big prominent institutions, like all these things that have helped to create this idea of eLife as a elitist organization. I think I was one of those people who would sometimes write eLife as eLite, E-L-I-T-E, just because it sort of captured how even I saw the organization at the beginning. And I think we intend to build on that experience with the Latin American editors to do a general call for editors, because I think people's confidence in a system that produces public assessments of papers is perhaps even more important than their confidence in one that produced private ones, because the assessments will be out there for everybody to see. And so it's really, really, really important that our system is representative of people who are doing science and who care about science as fun. And plus, I think the big problem with the kind of who do I know down the hall kind of way of recruiting editors and reviewers is there's just so much intellectual talent and interest and enthusiasm for science and publishing out there that we're just not. That is not an elitist point of view. It's a false elitist point of view, right? No system of merit or that I've ever seen supports that way of operating. It's lazy rather than effective. And so I think it's hard to vet people you don't know and have perhaps never heard of, and who are just sort of stepping forward to know whether they'll be good editors. It's hard to. Editing's not something everybody does well. I don't know. I don't think I'm particularly good at it, honestly. And I hate making decisions about papers. I feel it's one of my least favorite things about the process is telling someone your paper's in, your paper's out. I don't like it. It makes me a bad reviewer and editor. But I do think that we routinely experience and knew kind of on first principles that there's so many people out there who are not participating in the system, not because they wouldn't be really good at it, but just because they've never been invited. And so that's an ongoing and continuing push.
So what would happen if a situation arose where you had a reviewer who, despite all your best efforts, did just trash a paper for...
We wouldn't publish it.
No real reason, so you wouldn't publish it.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. That's the editor's job, is to make sure that the reviews are constructive. We do not view ourselves as being under any obligation to transmit the works of a reviewer if it's not constructive. And in fact, in order to really make sure that doesn't happen, we are not just going to take reviews and post them immediately. We are going to send them to the authors and give them a clear and easy mechanism to say, hey, these aren't fair, right? They can't say, I don't like what you concluded, but they can say almost anything else, right? If they think, first of all, I think a biggest problem is sometimes reviewers just get things wrong. They say, you didn't do this control, and they didn't, just because they didn't see it, right? Sometimes, at some level that's on the authors, right? Sometimes the control is buried in a supplement or something, but we don't want our reviews to be factually incorrect, obviously. And we certainly don't want them to be unfair. We certainly don't want them to be inappropriate. We certainly don't want them to be unconstructive. We hope that we will catch the vast majority of those issues prior to sending anything to so it's not like we're asking the authors to be our editors of our reviews, but we want to add in this extra safety valve, which is it's one thing to get unfair reviews if they're just sent to you. It's a very different thing to get unfair reviews that are posted in public. And so it's super important that we not necessarily have the consent of the authors always to post their reviews, because nobody will want something that it says anything that they don't, I don't know. We even try to say negative things nicely in our reviews, but I do think it's important that the authors have that safety valve to know that they've at least seen them and had a chance to give us feedback.
Yeah, I think one thing people haven't recognized so much is that the new system really will help with the problem with negative results never getting published. And that's that was one of the reasons I joined eLife. I had a negative result paper that trashed by reviewers at Nature Plants and a bunch of other journals before getting published. But in that case, I was like, publish the paper and publish the reviews, because the reviews were so bad. It was so obvious what the reviewers were doing. And this thing doesn't arise when you don't have an accept reject decision. And, even if the reviews make it through this process into the public, I think if they're really bad reviews, people will see that they're really bad reviews.
So one of the other things that I saw come along on Twitter was how you separate yourself out from something like Review Commons or Peer Community In, which also do reviews of preprints. Basically, the question I got was, why would somebody pay an APC when they can do this for free?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think I would encourage people to use PCI and Review Commons. And, obviously, like, we do things somewhat differently. The way we're writing reviews is different. We're adding these assessments that are meant to kind of crisply capture in a way that can be consumed, by non-specialists, can be used in contexts where an author has to convey to some third party what the journal thinks about a paper, right? We're not always, if you're reviewing job applicants and something, your first screen is not necessarily going to be to read every paper and its reviews, although obviously in an ideal world that would happen. I think realistically, having some compact way of conveying that is important in a lot of contexts. So we've put a lot of thought and effort into doing that. And so, so we're producing a marginally, but I think critically different product, in the sense that we, fundamentally what we're doing, Review Commons doing, and PCI and others are doing, is producing reviews of preprints. So at some level we're on the same team and working together in this way. But, like anything, there's some differentiation in the product on offer. And so I wouldn't tell anybody, like, I would vastly prefer people use either of those other options to not doing any kind of preprint review. So I'm certainly not going to complain. It's just like, when I'm talking to people about giving up eating meat, I don't care which plant-based meat they eat, even though I prefer the one I helped to create, right? So I think fundamentally the main thing is people should post preprints and have their preprints reviewed publicly. And however they do that, that's a good thing. If they don't think our product is superior to other people's and gives them anything, well then great. Like that's the way this should be functioning. They should choose us because we're doing something they value. And so yeah.
So I'll just add that I don't know about PCI, but at least with Review Commons, there's some important differences. Like in Review Commons, if you do get a negative review, you have the choice as an author not to have it published, or a review you don't like, which is very different from eLife's new system, where the reviews will go out, barring unfair reviews. And I think Review Commons views their product, or their customer rather, as the journals that they're serving a lot more than eLife, because eLife doesn't have a journal that it's sending the papers to, or an accept reject decision at the end of it. So it's a lot more public facing, I feel, compared to Review Commons. But yeah,
I mean, I would say eLife's focus is very much on the authors and scientists, right? Because those are the people who make the decisions and see all the output.
Yeah, but I should add that Review Commons is is motivated by the same broad goal. They've just chosen a different path, kind of, to get there. So I think it's interesting. Like now, like we've been participating in Review Commons system where we are a recipient of reviews from Review Commons, and then we use them to make publishing decisions. Since we're not making publishing decisions anymore, I don't know exactly like how we work together. Like what does it look like? But in some sense, that's mostly because we're now doing something that's much more similar to what they're doing than what we've been doing before. And so I very much view Review Commons as a partner in this enterprise, and I think the differences are far less significant than the similarities. Same thing with PCI and other people in the space. Like we're fundamentally trying to reach the same goal and just have marginally different paths to doing it. And I think we'll all learn from each other, and I think we'll all get better at what we're doing. And I hope that this ultimately leads to more kind of convergence in the system.
Somebody else want to know if any other journals are trying something similar that you know of, and if so, when would they be doing this transition?
I think there's lots of smallish kind of nascent operations that I couldn't catalog here that are trying to do something kind of along these lines. And I think there are, it depends on how you look at it. There are journals that publish reviews, and like I would sort of choose to look at this as more of a like, something that people do in little bits and dabs all over the place, right? Rather than like what differentiates us is that we're trying to put this all together into a single kind of coherent process, right? So I think, there's this group we support, Biophysics CoLab, which is trying to think about how to deal with preprint reviews, and they have their own flavor of it. There's lots, I've heard from lots of groups that are trying to get sort of things like this off the ground. What isn't out there, and I think perhaps more like what you're kind of getting at, is who are going to be the next big publishers to kind of embrace this move. I think that what we would like to see is for society publishers who have, I think, seen their influence in business eroded in many ways over the years as the big commercial publishers have sort of intruded on their turf, that they can see themselves in a different light in this model, right? If you're, I've been a member of the Genetic Society of America on and off, depending on whether or not their publishing policies have pissed me off over the years. Every once in a while they sign some really atrocious letter to Congress or something that makes me give up my membership. But Genetics, the journal, I love. It was the last journal I received and continued to receive in print because I've just loved reading it. Like, I love paging through it and seeing the articles from diverse areas of genetics. I kind of always was interested in them. Like, it had that right kind of targeting. But, Genetics, the journal, is only able to review papers that are submitted to it. Whereas in some ideal world, Genetics, the organization, via some evolution of Genetics, the journal, could move to a world where they view it as their job to write public reviews of every preprint posted that's relevant to geneticists. And like, there's a way of rethinking what societies do in the publishing space, away from being journal publishers and towards being, groups that review and curate and kind of communicate the community's assessment of work that's relevant to the field in new ways. So obviously there's financial barriers to them doing so. They make money from their journals that help fund the societies and so forth. So it's not a trivial challenge, but I think it's a much more stable, useful kind of way of conceiving of what role society should play in the communication process, to basically view themselves as the groups that organize and carry out and communicate the results of peer review of works in their field. And sometimes works are interesting to geneticists and biochemists and plant biologists and computational biologists. Like, there's no reason in this world that review be singular, right? Like, we can review a paper and post a reviewed preprint on eLife, and someone else can review that paper, and we'll figure out in the long run how to bring these all together in a common place and like maybe have more standardization. But right now, like, there's nothing that stops someone else from reviewing a paper just because we reviewed it. That whole idea that publishing is a singular path, that every paper only traverses in some singular way, is kind of silly, kind of antithetical to what the internet enables. So,
still thinking about the future, where do you think the experiments that Arcadia are doing would fit into this kind of stuff? Because that is a really, really interesting thing Practice doing there, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out and how they figure out all the bugs that will pop up along the way. But is that where you see potentially the future of all of this going, to smaller bits of peer review and experts reviewing individual bits that they can actually review rather than a whole paper, and then something like eLife bringing all those things together in a commentary?
I think they're a little bit too distributed. Like, it's very hard to read a review where parts of the paper have been reviewed by different people. There isn't a coherent voice or opinion expressed about the whole paper. I see the value in doing that, but I think you need an editorial function to aggregate all of that information and condense it down and present a much more succinct analysis or evaluation of a paper. Yes, and that I think is what eLife is doing. Like, something people haven't really picked up on so much is that eLife has this standardized vocabulary of terms that it's going to use to describe papers, but it's not using those just to describe papers. It can be used to describe parts of a paper. So you can have a part of a paper that's exceptional in terms of its significance, but another part that's not. There are elements of that, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's the next frontier in publishing, the one that we're not quite confronting, which is to rethink what the unit of publishing is, right? I mean, the paper, like the whole way we construct things is problematic, right? I think that part of the problem we have in science now is, we're not yet addressing this, and although I hope that by kind of moving to a world where authors have more control over what they publish, you can get there more readily, is, you know, people don't write papers to be read. They write papers to be reviewed, and they're documents that are meant to get past peer review, and they're meant to get past peer review in fancy journals. And so if you were to start from scratch and say, like, what should you be publishing? I mean, right? Like, there's somewhere between like a video of what's everything that's going on in your lab, constantly live streaming, and right, and a paper is the right point. And I don't know exactly where it is, because I don't think it's productive for everybody to think, certainly not enough to just dump your lab notebook online every day and say, okay, I'm doing my diligence to science, right? Like it does require some, not necessarily narrative, but at least path through it, so that somebody can understand why you did this and what you think about it, and sharing your own wisdom you learned and stuff. So there is some meta layer that's very useful in doing these things, but I don't know where it is. And I think the best thing about what Arcadia is doing is just saying, okay, well, we know that the existing thing isn't right, so let's try this and see what happens. And like, we're going to try a different way of publishing and a different way of peer review. And like, we're not just going to do it. I think, again, like, this is, for me, sort of an important philosophical point, is like, this is not just something you do as a side venture. It's not like Arcadia saying, we're going to do this and submit papers to Nature. They're saying, this is what we're doing. That forces you to make it as useful as possible. It gets everybody thinking about things in a different way. And like, I think it's the right approach. Whether the specific thing they're doing now is where we land, who knows? Probably not. Things will evolve. But I would say it's as likely to head in the opposite direction from where publishing is now as it is to get more similar to publishing. That is, to be more in a world where they're publishing individual little bits of things regularly, and kind of somehow kind of accumulating them into something new. It's the thing that makes sense given the way science is done and the technology we have at it, and this whole process of like thinking like you do science for 3 years and then somehow you like get it together. And like I had this great experience as I was teaching the other day. I was looking at a paper, and it's a paper that I was not involved in, but it was happening in a lab next to mine when I like 15 years ago. And like, I was reading the paper, and their narrative for the paper was all basically like, we found this interesting thing, right? Like, it's basically like, we're testing this hypothesis. Here's an interesting hypothesis. We did this experiment to test this hypothesis, and we found it's true. When I know that is false, right? Like, what they really did was, they're like, this would be a cool thing to do. They did the experiment. They found this cool thing. And then they're like, what narrative can I tell about how it worked, right? So the narrativization of science is often the fictionalization of science. And I think that there's something useful about the idea that like, you have to say what you're doing while you're doing it. And that to the extent that there's a narrative imposed on it subsequently, it's obviously a retrospective one and not a false prospective one, because it creates this idea that like everything had to be intentional and every experiment had to start with a clear direction and a test of a hypothesis, all of which are just falsehoods about the way science works. And so I hope that like, we can help head things down that direction by kind of breaking away from this idea that it's journals and the journal system that tells you how your paper should be structured. As Devang said, like, if someone wants to submit a Jupyter notebook to us, that's their work, that has a narrative in it and things like that. There's no reason why we can't peer review this. There's like, if someone wants to submit like a video method or something, like there's we can be a lot more flexible in principle. There are practical challenges always, but
just look at journals like bioinformatics or like, those journals that only publish web servers or software. It doesn't make sense. Like I published a paper a couple of years ago about a web server that we created, but like I had no need to actually write the paper. It was the most boring paper I have ever written. But just because of the structure of the world we live in, I had to write a paper describing a web server that was already live and that people could review just by clicking on the website. Like it really doesn't make sense, right?
Just to talk a little bit about Twitter, not that we don't do that enough on this show.
It won't exist by the time you publish.
I know.
By the time your podcast comes out, so it'll seem archaic, but sure.
I mean, I'm a lot more comfortable pushing Mastodon on people. That's
Yeah.
So you both are very active on Twitter, and you both spend a lot of time responding to quite sensible concerns and discussions, some not so sensible. How do you deal with the more ridiculous takes you come across? Because you both seem to do it in a relatively calm manner, which if you contrast to my Twitter is just an angry person shouting a lot. So how do you not let that affect your life when you come away from Twitter? Because there's a lot of it on Twitter.
Valium. No. It is frustrating. I think Devang probably has the same experience. The beauty of Twitter is the problem of Twitter too, which is that I really do think one of the things we do, I mean, some people don't like it, but I really do try to answer as many of these questions as I can and get into conversations with people without any concern over who they are or what their motivations are or anything. And, sometimes they degenerate when people are, it's frustrating for a scientist to deal with people who are thinking irrationally or have bad, are sometimes functionally disingenuously, it seems. Although I will say, these conversations, the vast majority of them are at least well-intentioned, if not well-reasoned. And so, I think it's like, this stuff is retail politics. People have individual concerns. And I think one of the things that happens on Twitter that you always have to be aware of is, and you saw this, I think, somewhat with the eLife launch, was you never know where kind of problem things are going to spiral out of control and become the way that people think about something, right? I mean, as you know, I've been involved in some of the most ludicrous, Twitter controversies in my life. How a random offhand joke about a worm becomes a 2-day thing with in the daily news and stuff. It's extremely hard to predict what it is that happens in the world is going to become the dominant way people think about something. So I'm always I really do feel like you fight fires and you try to the best thing you can do is try to explain what you're thinking. And when people say something that's just not accurate about what you're doing, is to try to explain. And I do think this conversation about the launch did get a little out of control with it. A view of this project was cemented in some people's minds before. One of the challenges we had was we really couldn't launch this at the moment, at a given, we had to announce it in advance before the thing existed, because it's not fair to authors to say we're just changing this tomorrow. We had to give them a little bit of leeway, and I think I don't know, maybe even more leeway than we've given, maybe just to get people to shift their way of thinking. Papers take a long time to germinate, and anyway, we had to announce it before it existed exactly. And because getting something to exist, it's it has to be out in the real world. You can't synthesize it all in the laboratory. And so, where we are in a real sense kind of figuring out a lot of things on the fly, it just did make it a little bit more chaotic than so people, there's a vacuum. The point is there was a little bit of a vacuum because people couldn't see what we were actually going to do. And so people were able to say, well, you're just going to make this into a triage journal, even though not only is that not our intention, it wasn't the way we were architecting it, but it's also true that we hadn't set down in stone exactly the ways we were going to fight against that. And maybe we could have or should have, but I kind of think that some of these things anyway, I think some of this was inevitable. Some of it we could have dealt with better in advance. But so it felt to me like really important to try to deal with it. And so I spent the better part of a week trying to answer as many of these questions and try to engage in as many kind of little mini debates as possible. But it was exhausting. It's exhausting. It's exhausting, and it is like psychologically exhausting, especially because there's a small fraction of people who like, turn this into kind of a personal, it's like somehow I was just personally responsible for destroying a world they liked. And I'm pretty immune to this stuff at this point, but not perfectly. And so, it's it's a weird world, as you know.
I'll say that it wasn't too bad. Like it was
Yeah, I
like,
agree.
like I before I got into publishing, I was working on GMOs, and like those people are like whole other level of, craziness on Twitter. So yeah, at least with academics, you can reason with them. So most of the time.
Sometimes I've had mixed experiences with reasoning with certain academics in public as well. I've got one question left. So if you could you're just given unlimited power, you can go crazy, and you could make a single sweeping change across any part of academia, what is that thing you would each change?
Any part of academia? Uh-oh.
Anything you like. You can fire all the Nobel Prize winners if you want.
Oh, we should do that already.
Yeah. Devang, I don't know. I mean, that's such an open-ended question. There's so many things broken in academia. It's a little like the whole way careers are structured and the way funding is dispensed and the concentration of power and funding at the individual and institutional level and the way we communicate. Like, I think that like the problem is like any individual thing doesn't fix enough stuff. Like I think it's like this weird science is at its absolute best now, right? Like the kind of things we can do are amazing. Like even compared to what we were able to do when I was a graduate student, like we can just decide power of science and the questions we can ask and the way we can do them are so much better. And yet the mechanics and the life of being a scientist and doing science is like progressively worse. And like, so there's this weird, like more people are participating in science and it's a more diverse and global thing. And like science is better. All that's great. And yet at the same time, like the actual experience of doing and being a scientist has been destroyed. And I guess that if I had this magic wand to wave, I would say we should focus much more of our energy and resources in ensuring that science is a good experience to participate in as an individual. And that's not to say it's like, you get paid an infinite fortune to do nothing. Like, I mean, it like that if you are willing to work really hard and dedicate yourself to questions and things like that there is a path, a very clear and stable path to being able to do it. And that requires changes in a lot of things. It requires changes in how we fund things. It requires changes in how we train people. It requires changes in how institutions are structured. It requires changes in how we publish. And like, so it's not a simple single tweak, but it is a simple single goal.
I'll say that I think publishing is probably one of the key, like probably the way I look at it is like papers are like, or what we publish or what we share as scientific findings, they're the currency, right? And all of us give different value to each of these different things that we produce. And then the funders are kind of like the central banks, like they decide the value of all of these things. So we can either change the funders, we can have lotteries in terms of how we do grant awards and things like that. But in the end, I mean, the publishing system is what needs to change. Like, even when you consider, why we have fewer women scientists who get funded, it's because they have typically lower H indexes, typically because they had lower citations, because they published less, because they didn't get enough money, because they didn't publish enough. And it's like just a cycle that just keeps going on. And at least publishing, I think, is one of the things that people don't focus on enough in terms of its impact on our lives.
So I think I would have said education. If we could educate everyone better during the training, we'll at least be aware of those issues and might tackle them a bit better.
I mean, I think we generally don't put enough attention into like I really hate these focus on incentives, because I think that's the wrong way of thinking about it. But we have, because like, look, people have choices as to whether they behave in a productive or counterproductive way. But I do think that we have a lot of really bad structures in science. And like trying to think about like I wish that we had some like science czar. Not that I don't really mean this, because I think inevitably they would just do a bad job. So I just mean like in some metaphorical sense, we spent a little bit more time thinking about the mechanics of science and how to make it work better, and not being so afraid of it. And one of the problems, and I think this is true in publishing and all these other things, is that often the things you want to do to fix the mechanics of science, in some sense, they come at a risk for people. Like they involve taking away things people have fought hard for, or putting in jeopardy things people can expect. And like, they almost inevitably, when we do them, seem to disproportionately, I mean, it's sort of inevitable that they disproportionately affect people who have achieved less in the world. And so like trying to figure out like not just how things should be, but how they should get there in a way that, like, even if the end state is optimal for everybody at some level, the path getting there isn't necessarily. And I think we constantly struggling with that question. Like, it would be way easier to just like vaporize science and start from scratch than it is to get from where we are to that point. And it's kind of why I think like, I think, for example, if I could press a button right now and vaporize science publishing industry, I like it. It would take me nanoseconds to press that button, because I think that like things like that, like if you could just get rid of things that are that the systems that exist are far more of a constraint than they are a benefit for changing stuff. And I think this. Academia too, like the whole structure of academic science is a similar function. If you could just vaporize it and still have the resources to start from scratch, I think it'd be good. So I think that maybe the answer to your question is to just blow it all up and start from scratch. But that's maybe not so easy to do.
Well, another thing I would suggest would be like get rid of tenure and get rid of fixed term contracts at the same time. And no at will employment like in the US. That's a bit crazy, but like just have, people get hired for long term, and they can get fired if they don't perform, but they don't have this fixed deadline after which they become suddenly, this elite superclass that can do anything that they want.
Promotion and relegation rather than
yes,
franchises.
Thank you so much for that, though. That was really, really good. And that's the show, folks. If you enjoyed listening, then hit that subscribe button to get the latest updates straight to wherever it is you're listening. Don't forget to rate us on Spotify or Apple, and follow us on Twitter at MotionPod. You can find links to things we've just discussed on our website, preprintsandmotion.com. If you'd like to tell us what you think, then send an email, shout at us on Twitter, or shout at us if you see us walking down the street. This has been a JMJ production, generously supported by our friends at ASAP Bio. Until next time, have a good week.
Where do I find out about the different bioarchive licenses? This CC, BY, CDXY nonsense is driving me nuts.
ASAP Bio have a resource for that.
Ugh, that's your answer to everything.
That's because they have everything you need to know about preprints.
Sure, they probably have the basics, like info on the preprint servers, but what else is there?
There's so much more. Looking to post a preprint but not sure what different journal policies are? They have a collection to help you out with that. There are meetings around preprints and associated services. If you want to know how preprint adoption has changed over time, there's even a page on that.
And COVID?
They have a big section on preprints and the pandemic, plus some really cool infographics for communicating preprints.
And university policies? Surely they don't have that.
They collect uni policies where possible.
Okay, they do sound pretty impressive, but is it not a bit of an echo chamber?
It can be, but ASAP Bio also engage with people who don't love preprints and have concerns. So we had an excellent discussion on this very topic a couple of months ago.
Oh, is there anything ASAP Bio don't do?
Honestly, no, they're so nice over there. They were so quick to jump in and support this show. It's your one-stop shop for info on preprints and open science initiatives, so head over to asapbio.org to learn more and subscribe to their newsletter for the latest in preprint news. If you want a deeper dive into the world of preprints, then look out for the next recruitment of ASAP Bio Fellows.